Good morning and welcome to another edition of Good Morning Trinidad and Tobago. I'm Vina Barrett. Remember, we're also on Talk City 91.1 FM and online at ctvtt.com. Well, the budget a few days away and government's just concluded spotlight on our financial circumstances. Quite a bit to discuss. Now, the American Chamber of Commerce was part of the event yesterday, and back in July, they submitted their inputs for fiscal package. Now, in with us is AMCHAM's President Michel de Silva, Chief Executive of AMCHAM. Is that correct?
President.
Okay, President of AMCHAM.
Yes.
All right, so good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. Fine, thank you.
So you were present at yesterday's spotlight.
Yes, we were.
All right.
Active participants.
So tell us a little bit about the ideas that were put forward. What generally would you say your overall view of that entire participation was like?
Well, firstly, good morning to you and to your viewers. And I would like to think that yesterday's session was the beginning of what I would like to call a social compact. Because what I think what the government did is clearly articulate where we are as a country from an economic standpoint. And they sort of reached out to the audience to ask for, okay, how do we move forward given this context? And I don't know that if people don't know where we are now after yesterday, then they choose to keep their heads buried in the sand. Because we had different presenters articulate clearly where we are from a revenue perspective, where we are from a debt perspective, where we are from an expenditure perspective. And an interesting statistic that was shared is that we've reached a point where our imports, the amount we pay to buy goods, is exceeding our exports. So that's a situation that can't persist. So it's really a function of getting everybody to move in a particular direction. First, create the understanding, and then what do we do to remove ourselves from this situation? And that was what yesterday was about from a macro perspective. And then there were things that we discussed in more detail that are intended to deal with the situation. No solutions were provided yesterday because we all recognize that we didn't get here overnight, and it's going to take us quite some time to remove ourselves from the situation. And there still, frankly, is a sense that people may not act as quickly as we need because there's a feeling as though we are not at the end of the road. And only when we reach the end of the road or we hit the proverbial brick wall will we react. And that's what we all are trying to avoid. Let us not wait till the crisis is to such a large extent that we are forced. We need to take steps now that avert the crisis. But those steps require difficult decisions.
Now, based on that reality check, I would like to call it,
yes.
What are the crucial areas that AMCHAM has advised government to focus on for this budget? Or now, bearing in mind all this information, data and statistics that they would have put forward, what is your advice to government with this budget?
Right, so the advice is, I can break it into two broad segments. So there's the short term, which you have to do immediately. Then there's the medium to long term, recognizing that this situation cannot be resolved overnight. So clearly on the short-term side, we have to look at our expenditure profile and how we rein that in to a degree that brings it closer to our revenue, but doesn't shock the system overly, recognizing that there will be a shock. So when you look at the degree of subsidization in the system, it is inordinately high relative to the revenue streams that we have. There was a point in time when we could have afforded subsidies, but we've reached a point where we can no longer afford it to the same level. So we are heavily subsidized in Trinidad, water, electricity, fuel. Those are things that the government has to look at seriously and determine how much of those subsidies it can pull back. We've already tackled GATE, and I think the initiative with GATE as using the means test approach is an appropriate way to go. And we are not advocating that the government pull away any expenditure directed to tertiary education because that really builds capacity in the economy. And if you take out that, you hurt yourself more than you help yourself. So when you look at the medium to long term, we have advocated for very long that the government should look at its policy framework. Now, what policies are you putting in place to take a country to where you want it to be? We are strong advocates for policies that create and drive accountability and discipline. So we have agitated significantly for the operationalization of the procurement legislation and the framework around it. So that's the staffing of the office, the appointing of the board, the hiring of the regulator, him or herself. That will bring a level of accountability and discipline into the system that today is seemingly absent. And that's a question we raised yesterday at the forum. And one of the issues that we face really is enforcement. So we can have all this legislation, we can have all these laws and all these rules and all these mechanisms, but if there's an absence of enforcement, it all goes to waste. So that's another critical area. The second area that we believe from a policy perspective the government should adopt is the concept of fiscal rules. Now, we've seen our neighbors in the Caribbean having to adopt fiscal rules. And broadly speaking, what fiscal rules dictate is that you have to have a certain expenditure pattern relative to your revenue intake. And that is codified, again, in law. So it removes the ability of any government to exceed certain thresholds unless there are exogenous circumstances that cause you to do it. So it means that you have to operate within a certain pattern. You're allowed to run deficits to some degree, but not beyond a certain level. And it brings a discipline to how you manage your finances. Grenada has done it, Jamaica has done it. Excuse me. But those two economies have done it because the IMF has imposed it on them. We have said, and the Prime Minister alluded to it, we should be taking medicine before it is prescribed. Well, vitamins as opposed to medicine.
All right, so now Dr. Thackeray Driver, he spoke of energy conservation and addressing issues of an aging population in the area of oil and gas. He wants government to focus a little bit more on the service sector. What are your comments on that?
We agree with Dax's point of view. We think services are the way for us to look to further transform and diversify the economy. We have been blessed with an energy sector that is capable of competing globally. So we have oil, we have gas, and we can sell that commodity, or those two commodities, in a global market and a global market price. When you look at what else we produce in Trinidad and Tobago, the question that arises, at least for us, is what else do we have that can be relevant globally or competitive globally? The basket becomes very small when you look at it from that perspective. But services is an area which is really built on your intellectual capacity, the quality of your education, and the intellect of your population, where you can have global relevance. We already have a strong energy services sector, and the developing provinces around us, Guyana, Suriname, where we can export those services to. So energy services is something that we need to push further. Areas of ICT and other intellectually based, service-oriented industries we believe is the way for us to go.
In terms of agriculture, during the break you mentioned a term to me, instead of CPEP, Farm PEP.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So we've spoken a lot about CPEP and what it is and what we think it isn't. You know, CPEP, we could use those resources more productively, we believe. And agriculture is an area that we need to focus on significantly because to the extent we could reduce our food import bill, it helps. To the extent we could develop an industry that results in export, it obviously helps. The problem we have in agriculture is a lack of labor. And one of the reasons why business has an issue with CPEP is that CPEP removes a pool of labor from the market. So, and it creates a certain work ethic because CPEP results, unfortunately, in short work hours for pay that is reflective of longer work hours. So that ripples through the system. So that CPEP model has to be revisited, and one of the suggestions in revisiting it is to look at directing some of that pool into the agricultural sector, where we hope we can reap more productivity from the resource. It would not work, obviously, if we take the same CPEP model and put it to Farm PEP. So you work for 3 hours in an industry, but you get paid for 8, and the productivity issue doesn't go away. So we have to address that productivity issue, and that's why everybody has to be involved in this conversation.
Yeah, it's important that you mentioned that everybody should be involved because you said that you also mentioned that the back-end incentives, we have an issue where the incentives are to the back rather than engaging persons to start new businesses. Tell us a little bit about that problem.
Sure. So the Minister of Finance has raised this point on several occasions, and he's right to a degree. We have multiple incentives for various industries. We have incentives in tourism, we have incentives in agriculture, and the list goes on and on. But when you look at the incentives from a macro perspective, to realize the incentive, it means you have to establish something. You have to actually start a business or begin an idea or process. So then, if you're asking yourself the question, why aren't these incentives being utilized? our position is then when you have to look at the front end, and what are the front end incentives that would allow somebody to transition from an idea to a business that would realize the back end incentives, the tax breaks, etc. The front end, and Ron Hines said it well yesterday, there are disincentives to starting business. There are disincentives to doing business in Trinidad. And while we moved up the competitive index yesterday, we are still in the bottom half. So there's much work to be done. So the bureaucracy that is involved in starting a business overwhelms the investor. Crime is obviously a significant deterrent today. And it has become an increasingly larger deterrent over time. So an investor having to face a bureaucracy and then having to deal with the issues of crime at all levels, so there's the violent crime and white-collar crime, and one feeds the other, those act as disincentives. So if you are able to address those things, and address those things to the benefit of the individual, or that the investor understands, I no longer have to meander through a bureaucracy to get what I want done. I am less concerned about crime, and less concerned because we are never going to be totally rid of crime. Then you would see more persons moving into those areas where the incentives reside. And the government will find itself in a position that, okay, maybe we have overshot and we have over-incentivized businesses, and the incentives could be less. Because obviously the incentives come at a cost to government. They have to give up something because their expectation is that they will gain. And right now we're not gaining. And to repeat, we believe they're not gaining because there are other factors away from the incentives that detract the business from pursuing those avenues that government would like pursued.
Now, agriculture has been getting the least allocation for budgets. Mm-hmm. It's been going on for some time now. What do you think, how can we begin to make agriculture more attractive?
Well, in this particular budget cycle, we're not going to solve it with more revenue allocation. I think everybody's going to get less. Agriculture becomes attractive if we deal with the labor issues. Many people are not going into agriculture in a meaningful and significant way because they simply can't get labor. Agriculture remains labor intensive. There could be some degree of mechanization, but how many people can afford to mechanize their production is the question. So you can find some of that happening, but we think a key issue in the agricultural sector is the labor issue, and it's the legal framework. So predial larceny is still a significant issue. And again, it goes back to what the Prime Minister said yesterday. We have many laws on the books, but we have an issue of enforcement. So we looked at the government for policy and framework, and we also looked at them for the enforcement. And once the policy, framework, and enforcement is working, then the actors in the economy should stand up and begin to act as the government intends and as we need.
You mentioned the term social compact. Government trying to achieve this. How do we even begin to achieve this?
Right. So my takeaway from yesterday is that, and this wasn't said yesterday, but my takeaway is that I believe this could be the start of a social compact because, and Dr. Hussain said it yesterday, what you have to have is everybody rowing in the same direction. Unfortunately, what we have is people rowing in different directions. So yesterday was about bringing a sense of sobriety to the national conversation. This is where we are. The party is over and the hangover is here. Understanding that these facts are undeniable, it's an attempt, I believe, to bring everybody to a side, to a place, to say, okay, we understand this is where we are. We are here, but we want to be here. How do we get to here? Understanding that there are going to be difficult conversations and hard decisions that are going to affect people adversely. So we have to embrace labor, private sector, government, civil society, the religious bodies. It's very much like what happened in Barbados maybe 20 years ago when it faced its first crisis. Barbados developed a social compact that where the compact said there are certain things we will hold fast to, these core principles. Everything else is up for debate, but these core things we believe are the things that will take us forward. So for us, we have to identify what those core things are, get the agreement and alignment that those are the core things that we will stick to, and move on that basis. Because there will be things that will detract from the core, but should not be primary to the core. And that is when meaningful engagement and dialogue with all the stakeholders is important. And the fact that NTAC has been reconvened with the participation of labor is a step in the right direction. And it's not going to be an easy road. There's going to be significant friction. But we have to all go into it understanding that, but with the perspective and the mindset that we are doing this to create a better environment for the generation to come.
Dr. Valmiki Arjun would have mentioned, UE economist. He spoke on diversification and, as you said, offering incentives. With respect to diversification, you spoke about ICT earlier on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, from the perspective of, as I mentioned previously, when you look at where diversification is possible, is more practical than possible, you have to look at things that don't necessarily involve the production of goods and services, because goods and services compete really with a global marketplace and people who can produce those things much more cheaply. Trinidad has a significant, and we rank very highly on our education index. So we have a well-educated population. And that is unlikely to change or should not change. So you want to leverage the intellectual capacity onshore Trinidad to attract those businesses in software development, call centers at a very low level, and the development of various apps and furthering of the digitization initiative. Those businesses require intellectual capacity, and they require a certain infrastructure. So they require connectivity, and they require a base from which to work, and a stable one. We are a stable economy. We've built significant infrastructure under e-tech, and we have an educated population. So we have the ingredients to begin to attract those businesses that are looking for talented minds that can propel their initiatives.
Now, you have a post-budget forum, I understand, October 4th. Tell us a little bit about it.
So our feature speaker will be Alison West. So I think the public should be very excited to hear what Alison has to say. She's a new addition to the Ministry of Finance, obviously coming from the private sector, where I believe her focus is on tax. So it will be very interesting after the budget is read on Monday to understand what initiatives the Minister of Finance is laying out in that area. And obviously Ms. West can speak to that. So we also have Garvin Jofield from Republic Bank. He's the head of the Economic Intelligence Unit. Nicole Joseph, tax partner from KPMG. So it looks as though we're going to be focusing quite a bit on tax. And then finally, we're bringing in a colleague of ours from Washington, Ruben Von Smith. He's going to present a confidence survey that was done on the hemisphere. So it will speak to Trinidad and where Trinidad fits in the hemisphere from a business confidence perspective. So it's good to bring a broad lens as to where we are relative to others and where this region is and where this region is headed. And that really comes from our reach into an organization called ACLA. AMCHAM Trinidad is part of an association of all of the AMCHAMs in the Caribbean and Latin America. So there are 24 chambers representing 28 countries. And we meet 3 times a year. Last week was the final meeting. And really to discuss issues that are affecting the hemisphere. So that allows us to act as a vehicle for businesses in Trinidad that want to explore opportunities away from Trinidad in this hemisphere, so South, Central, and Latin America.
Okay, and who is invited to this event?
It's open to the public. Members obviously have a preferential price, but it's being hosted at the Hilton, starting at 7:30. This is something that we do annually, and we do get a very good turnout. And it's a time for us to ventilate the issues, to give some perspective on what the minister has laid out in his budget. Now, we don't really have a lot of time to analyze what he said, but you know, we do have a sense as to the direction he will be heading in come Monday. Not that yesterday, and the Prime Minister tried to make it clear that yesterday wasn't about Monday's budget. Yesterday was about the beginning of a dialogue. And he is committed to continue that dialogue. But yesterday did give us a sense as to what may be coming, and what we expect to be coming is a package that will take a little time for us to digest as a people, because there are going to be some difficult decisions made there.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. De Silva. It was a pleasure chatting with you this morning.